Well, I started into the service in June of '43 um, as a draftee and went to Texas for basic training. And after 1 year of college, I was an Army Specialized Training Candidate, ASTP. Went to Texas A&M for the winter of '43 and '44. And early in the spring of '44, all of the services needed replacements for casualties. They disbanded the ASTP, and us college boys went to the ground forces.
You went to Europe, didn't you?
True. I was in the European Theater of Operations with the 103rd Infantry Division. I'll have to remember to repeat that, but certainly we entered combat in the Vosges Mountains in France on Armistice Day, November 11, 1944.
What was the scariest time in your service?
Well, the scariest time in the service, I of course was very fortunate to be in the field artillery. Our piece was a 155 millimeter howitzer, a very new gun developed while I was in basic training, and probably the time we entered Germany for the first time, crossed the Rhine River, because the Krauts threw everything they had at us once we were positioned in the fatherland, so to speak.
Okay. Tell us how you became a sergeant.
Well, this occurred, I was throughout combat. I was a PFC, and recruiters would come to our artillery batteries and say, hey, you enlisted men, you could be a second lieutenant in 6 weeks. Just go to OCS, Officers Training School, candidate school. And we knew that 2nd Louis ended up as platoon leaders in the infantry, so they had few volunteers. But when we returned to the States, I was on my so-called recuperation furlough when the bomb was dropped on Hiroshima. And we who were scheduled to invade Japan knew that and we soon were informed that the war was over. And certainly that was a great thrill. I returned to Camp Campbell, Kentucky, and we veterans, there were probably half a dozen of us in the battery, had other recruits that came on late, were drafted, and were supposed to be training them. And then, of course, after the probability of invading Japan ceased, we all relaxed. So I became battery clerk, and at accepted intervals, I would put a paper in front of the captain promoting me from PFC to corporal to technician 4th grade, which is equivalent to a sergeant, and that's how I advanced in rank. We were all very relaxed. I would, as a battery clerk, I would get 2-day passes every weekend for myself and my buddies. The captain would sign them. We'd take off, get back for duty Monday morning, and it was a time when the discipline that we had suffered or had during the war was totally absent. So it was kind of a fun time, if you can believe a fun time in the Army. But the commissioned officers really didn't care too much. They knew that they had a choice of either going on into a permanent service or being discharged at the convenience of the government. And of course, we veterans knew we would get out in due time.
Do you ever meet with any of your unit buddies?
I went to a 103rd Infantry Division reunion in Grand Rapids, Michigan 2 years ago. Actually, it'll be 2 years in September. Looked for artillery people, actually took my gunner corporal, who was in my section battery throughout combat, and who was rather debilitated, took him in a wheelchair. And we enjoyed the reunion, but we saw no reason to go back because we couldn't find very many of our comrades that were in the field artillery. So, so we had a good reunion, and that's where I got the cap.
I was living in Denver, Colorado. I was drafted and into the Army in 1950, probably around September. I'm not even sure. I should know that, but it's September of 1950.
When did you get to Korea, and what did you do there?
I went to Korea from northern Japan, Hokkaido, as an advance party. The winter, onset of winter, 1951. It was probably about October.
Did you ever get to meet MacArthur while you were there?
No, MacArthur was on his way out. Mr. President Truman, and he was having a little set-to about MacArthur wanting to push the war back up to Indochina. And so they had a party in the way. Truman pulled MacArthur out of the Far East about the time I was in Korea.
Mm-hmm. What kind of action did you see? Did you fight Koreans or did you fight Chinese?
As far as I know, every enemy unit was a Chinese unit, Chinese infantry. This is front line, MLR, main line of resistance. And the Chinese, I'll give them credit, they were probably good fighters for what they had. They were not equipped as well as we were.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. What were you, an infantryman or?
Yes, I was wound up as a platoon sergeant, and I don't know if you want to go into that, but drafted and put into the Oklahoma National Guard, and the National Guard, through politics, was pulled out of Korea thanks to a Senator Kerr said that wasn't a declared war, and he wanted everybody with an NG serial number out of Korea. So when they left, all the rank of any, that is NCOs, almost left, and suddenly I was a sergeant first class with a platoon to run. Mm-hmm. Myself and 37 people, excuse me.
Mm-hmm. Tell us about the colonel.
Pardon?
Tell us about the colonel.
Oh, there was a Colonel Ford came up there one day, and he called as many as they could of the first three graders, that is sergeant on up, NCOs, and asked us if any of us was interested in being getting a field commission. He said he could have probably arranged a field commission, but if any of us was interested in it. And I said, well, Colonel, in all respect to your rank and all, there's got to be a catch to this. He said, well, the catch probably to you is one more year of enlistment. And I asked him, I said, is that one more year in the Far East? He says, yes, I'm sorry to say it'll be Far East. I said, in other words, you want me to sign on for a second lieutenant rank, possibly, and commit myself to one more year of more combat? I said, I don't believe I want any part of that. I'll tell you what I'd like to have from you, the colonel, is a honorable discharge. If you could get that for me right now, you can take everything I've got on my back, my weapons, anything I've got, and leave me standing here with no clothes on. Just give me that honorable discharge. And he says, Sergeant, you're a little bit bitter about this situation. I said, Colonel, again, in all respect to your rank and all, you spend a few nights up here getting shelled for an hour or two. you'll understand what I'm talking about. But that was about the end of that. He didn't come back up there anymore.
Were you injured at all?
Yes, I have a service-connected disability. Out on a hill out in front of where we were at, went out there, tried to hold a hill one night, and we got 4 hours of artillery. And I see by the Iraq War that there's a lot of friendly fire. We didn't call it friendly then, but I think half of the 4 hours of artillery was from the enemy, the Chinese, and half of it was our own, because a lot of times you'd almost have to call artillery in almost on top of you to keep the waves of Chinese coming at you. And that's the way it went.
I was an orphan, quote unquote orphan. And I had parents, but went to an orphanage, and the family situation was bad. Grew up in Kentucky. I loved Kentucky, and I still do. But I wanted to get away from the family situation. So I got everything done ahead of time. I went to the Air Force recruiter. I got all my tests, everything done ahead of time, and was sworn in on my 18th birthday, March 26, 1952.
Okay, what did you do while you were in the service, and how did you wind up being a Korean veteran?
I was a Korean veteran just by the fact that I was in during the Korean War. At the time, women were not allowed to go overseas until they were 21, and I was only 18. And before I reached the age of 21, I had married my sergeant in charge and was no longer in the service. So I went to Lackland Air Force Base for basic training. And Lackland at that time was just starting into the basic training. In fact, a couple of years ago, I was invited back to a celebration of 50 years of basic training at Lackland Air Force Base. And it was more fun. I was there for the women who were on Lackland, and there was one other gal who was in the 1st WAF Squadron, but she took her basic at Kelly before they opened up Lackland. And they asked us to get up in front of the group of women recruits and talk. And they expected us to tell something profound, I'm sure, but we told war stories instead, and it was more fun.
How did those young women accept you?
Oh, I think they were sort of fascinated with us because we were grandmother age for them. And they were very, very nice young ladies. Mm-hmm. And from Lackland, I went to Scott Air Force Base for electronics training and radio. And when I finished radio, they put me in airborne mechanics. And I graduated there and went from there to, well, let's see, I got my first stripe out of basic training. We had classes down there too. And if you got in the upper percentage, you got a stripe. I got my stripe there. Second stripe I got out of radio school because I was in the top 5% of the class. And then I went to Mather Air Force Base was my permanent base. Mm-hmm. And should I tell a funny story here?
Oh, yes.
Okay. The first day that I was on the squadron, went up to the squadron and they put me on the mock tower. That was where the pilots called in to make sure that the equipment was ready so that the plane would go up. Well, it was my very first day and I wasn't really sure about the logistics of how they did things there. And everybody left and went to coffee and left me there by myself. And I was petrified. When they came back, I thought sure I had planes up in the air that didn't have wings on them. And so I was so upset, I threw a pencil at my sergeant in charge. He could have brought me up on charges, but he married me instead. And Dale and I couldn't, because I had special training, I could not, they would not let me out of the Air Force when I got married, which a lot of women did in those days. When you got married, you got out. But when I got pregnant, it was an automatic out.
Okay. Okay, tell us about your veterans organization that you're a charter member of. Give us the name and tell us what this organization is.
Do you mean the Korean veterans?
No,
the women's, yes. Up until a few years ago, there was no memorial for the women. I was used to it being the Forgotten War, but the women were forgotten twice, so but they started it, and I was one of the charter members, and I went back a couple of years ago to see it, and it is a beautiful thing. They've done a great job. They have records of a lot of the women, and it's just a museum. It's fabulous for the women.
Okay, tell us a little bit about your Korean War veteran activities and especially your parade organization.
Well, I was just elected first vice president of the Queen City chapter of Korean War veterans. And all of a sudden, I don't remember if I've ever been in a parade other than the military things as such, but now all of a sudden I'm in charge of the parades. I'm sure learning a lot. But we were in Denver. The first one that I was in charge of was the Memorial Day Parade in Denver. And that was great. We had quite a few. Of course, we have our own bagpiper. Ken Geis is one of our members, and he's a fabulous bagpiper. And we had, my husband and I have restored a 1965 Corvair, and we use it just for parades. So that was the first parade that we had it in. And then my son, who is the fire chief at Blackhawk, said, well, Mom, I have an antique fire engine. Well, I'll bring it down and we'll put that in there too. And we had a lot of, we had some children who got in the back in the bed of the fire engine. And one of the members told me the other day that their granddaughter just talks about that all the time. It's going to be a memory for life for her. And then we went to the Greeley Stampede Parade. That one that brought tears to your eyes. There were 70,000 people lining the parade route. And every once in a while you'd hear somebody, they'd all stand up for the flag, which I've noticed a lot of people don't these days. And every once in a while somebody would yell, thank you. And you know, I just popped the buttons right off my shirt. I was so proud.
What's your next parade?
The next parade is the Cheyenne Frontiers Days, and we're going up there on the 19th. And we have 2 or 3 others that are lined up.
I graduated from high school in June of '50, 14 days before the war started. And I didn't know where Korea was, honestly. So I had planned to go to college on a basketball scholarship that fall, went ahead, but became quite anxious about the situation and left with many others at the holidays and went into Navy. Later, after boot camp, got into the aviation.
How did you get your commission?
was not a commissioned officer.
Oh, I thought you were
I was too young. I had just turned 19, and in those days, in order to qualify for Navy pilot training, you had to have at least 2 years of college. So I wasn't enlisted personnel.
What did you do as EM?
I was in ordnance. I was attached to a fighter squadron, and our primary equipment was 50 caliber machine guns and other types of ordnance. And I did that as well as materiel.
What ship were you on?
Our squadron was attached to Air Task Group 2, and we were on the USS Essex, which was one of the major carriers of that time. In fact, all of the carriers of that class were called Essex class carriers, which was CVA-9.
What kinds of planes were you flying in those days?
We were one of the last squadrons to use the F-4U-4 Corsair, which was the gull-wing aircraft which had been introduced in 1942 in World War II. And we used them primarily for close air support and bombing runs on facilities, and they were very adaptable, and the speed was correct for mountain ranges.
How did you get involved in veterans activities, and what are you doing now?
Well, I've been involved in veterans activities most recently in the last 3 years. And I joined the Korean War Veterans Association, the Queen City Chapter 195 of Denver, and all of the gentlemen from and ladies from various branches of service. We have people from every branch of service in this organization, with the exclusion of Coast Guard. We cannot find a Coast Guardsman.
Okay. Dave, should we use that parade picture with him, even though Nancy talked about the parade?
Sure, we can.
Okay. Tell us about your parade activities.
We started our first parade in at Veterans Day in 2001, November. And we introduced our membership to the parade. We filed an application with the parade committee and were entered as an entry as the Korean War Veterans Association.
What other parades have you been in?
We've been
especially this year's.
Most recently, just on the 4th of July, last Friday, we were in the Greeley Stamp Independence Day parade, which was a tremendous turnout. Over 70,000 people, we were told, attended that parade. We were also connected to the Veterans Day parade in November, as I mentioned earlier, and Memorial Day parades in Denver. We're also entered in the coming parade at Cheyenne on the 19th of July.
Okay.
Enlisted in 1955, in January of 55, boot camp in Racine, Wisconsin, or thereabouts. Went from there to Corps School, from Corps School to Bremerton, Washington as a surgical tech. That was another school that I took. Most generally, I was always in school. From the Bremerton, Washington duty station, I went aboard the USS Ajax in 1957. From 57 through 59, I was aboard the Ajax. Went to Sasebo, Japan, which was my duty station. And the home port was San Diego. And the Ajax was a tender, destroyer, submarine, and anything else that pull up us alongside, and did surgical duties and corpsman duties aboard the ship. That's...
Okay. You've got the oxygen. Tell us why you've got the oxygen. and bring in the word asbestos.
pretty hard not to do that. In 1957, when I boarded the Ajax, nobody knew anything about that, asbestosis. The surgical room, as you can see by the picture there, is right underneath the 5-inch 38, or actually it's the bigger gun than that. But when they would go out on practice shoots, the room in which we would do surgery, fortunately we never did, would actually rain this dust. I had no idea what it was. And it took from 57 through just this past year to show up. And that's why I'm wearing this. It's a progressive disease like emphysema. It takes a while, but the ultimate end is the lungs lose the efficiency to convert the oxygen into the blood. And that's it for that.
How did you use your Navy experience in civilian life?
Prior to civilian life, I was employed at a supermarket, and this gentleman said that he would send me through chiropractor school if I would go into the Navy and be a corpsman, so I could get firsthand information. I did such, and when I come back, he was gone. But I followed through with it with ambulance driver and first aid attendant at Martin Company. From there, I went into research as a research technologist and did all kinds of research on animals of specific types. I won't name the types, but I acquired all this medical knowledge plus the electronics that I did. And in a sense, the Navy started that. That desire, you could find me in the gyro area or in the electronics area aboard ship. Majority of my time was spent there helping the guys out, working on different equipment, and which was fun. At that time was very exciting. And the surgical tech portion was very exciting. If they would have left me in Bremerton, Washington, at the hospital there as a surgical tech, I'd probably be still there now. And so it was very enjoyable. And board ship was okay too.
In your veteran years now, what do you do?
My vocation until retirement, I was an echocardiographer. That's where you look at the heart with ultrasound, which we first started at the University of Colorado in 1961. And it has since blossomed into quite an occupation. But we could tell malfunctions of valves and the efficiency of the heart, to just name two. There are so many things it'll do now you wouldn't believe it. But it was started with a single transducer and blossomed to a mechanical transducer. It had 2 dimensions. It now, by the way, has 3 dimensions to it. That's depth, width, and also you can see through it, okay? And you can rotate it, all kinds of things.
Did this all spring from your Navy experience?
I really believe it did. I was, I don't think I had the intellectual ambition to be a doctor. As I look back on it now, I could have. So the Navy provided me with the energy to go ahead with what I thought I had at that time, and I've just followed it through. So actually I've only had 4 jobs since graduating high school.
Well, after I took basic training at Sampson Air Force Base, which was formerly a naval training station, I was sent to Cheyenne, Wyoming, to Fort Warren, F.E. Warren Air Force Base. And at Francis E. Warren, I went through what was called the Administrative and Chaplain's Assistance course. I was very fortunate to graduate towards the top of the class, and I was entitled to stay there because of that. I stayed and became an instructor in the same course that I'd been through. I taught basically the new chaplains coming in addition to the assistants that were in the chapel. And the chaplain's assistant would set up schedules, do just about what a church secretary would do in the present day.
Why did you decide to go into the military?
I had prepared myself to be an MD. I'd come from a medical family, and I was getting my papers all ready to go to the University of Colorado when I felt I received a call to the ministry. I went into the ministry and attended the Denver Seminary after I graduated from the University of Northern Colorado. Was ordained in 1962 and have held 5 pastorates since then. I enjoy the ministry because it's working with people, and I like people. I like also to prepare and to speak, and having had the experience of counseling, today am writing a book on a circuit riding preacher. My wife, who passed away a month ago's great-grandfather, was a circuit riding preacher in Larimer and Weld County. I'm taking the ideas that he used and putting it in a fictional basis in Douglas County.
How long were you in the service, and why did you decide not to stay in the service?
I was in for 4 years. The time I was in, I was planning to come out, finish up my pre-med, and go on to medical school. I had thought at the time perhaps I would stay in the service. If I did, I was going to go to OCS and probably go into the chaplaincy on a full basis.
I was in the Marine Corps for 4 years.
Did you enlist?
I did. I enlisted.
Volunteer?
Volunteer.
Okay. Why did you choose to go into the Marine Corps?
I chose to go in the Marine Corps. My brother was in the Marine Corps. I have a lot of friends that were in the Marine Corps, and I saw the camaraderie between them, and that was something I wanted in my life too.
Did it work out that way?
It did. I think I grew closer to my brother, friends of mine also, and developed relationships in the Corps that are pretty strong now.
Mm-hmm. What did you do while you were a Marine?
I was in the band, musician.
A musician. What did you play?
Played the saxophone.
Mm-hmm. How in the world did you ever wind up in that? I thought Marines were fighting types.
They are. There's a saying: every Marine is a rifleman first, and we always train on that every year. But how I ended up in the band is I've played my whole life the saxophone, and it was really appealing, the musicianship and the professionalism that the Marine Corps band has, and that's why I joined the band.
Mm-hmm. Where did you serve?
I served in Okinawa for 1 year, and then I served in New Orleans for 2 years, last 2 years.
Mm-hmm. In New Orleans?
New Orleans. Marched a lot of Mardi Gras parades.
A lot of Mardi Gras. Okay. When you look back at your Marine Corps experience, what did that do for you in the civilian life where you are now?
Well, being a police officer, I believe it helped a lot. It made me more disciplined. It helped me out that way. Made me have a better work ethic, which helps in police work. You always have to be disciplined. Just the way that they teach you in the Marine Corps, the types of work ethics that they instill in you, definitely helps. And I think in any job you do in civilian life, but I think a lot in what I do too.
Mm-hmm. Would you recommend the Marines to anybody, just anybody?
Well, we're not called the few and the proud for nothing. I wouldn't. I don't think I'd recommend it to anybody. There's definitely a type of person that goes in the Marine Corps, and it's. I think any Marine would tell you it's a little cut above than the normal person.
What type? What is that type?
Somebody who wants excellence, who wants a lot of discipline and ethics in their life. Somebody that's not afraid of a big challenge and wants to accomplish something bigger than themselves.
Do you think that you're better than people from other branches of the service in that way?
No, I think all branches of service have their own different type of jobs. We all have a job. We're all on the same team. I don't think anyone's better than the other. It's just a different type of camaraderie or type of different jobs that they do.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. Let's see. Okay, tell us what your rank is, and tell us what that medal is that's up there on your pocket.
My rank is sergeant. The medal right here.
Mm-hmm.
This is a shooting badge. This is a marksmanship. There's 3 levels. Every year you have to qualify on the rifle and hone your skills every year for that. And you get a badge depending on what score you shoot.
Are you in any reserve unit?
I'm an inactive reserve.
What does that mean?
Which means I don't have to do anything, but if something big happens, they're always free to call me for the next about 3 years.
For the next 3 years?
It's a 4-year. It's a 8-year contract for active reserve and for inactive, or active duty for inactive reserve.
Okay.